Right, Kodak Retina IIa, and it's time to do the shutter. The shutter is a Synchro-Compur. Just pop the retaining ring, the shims, front group was loose. The trim ring from the front, the rear group was not loose. Not a dust visible there. Very unusual to see that inside the shutter. It's got a funny look, that shutter. It's very grey. I suspect it's been flood cleaned. Now, flood cleaning is when someone... Yeah, that front ring. I noticed that front ring was loose. You can see this lock screw here. That's only just caught in its groove. It should be rotated around. Flood cleaning is when someone takes a shutter and instead of stripping it right down to clean all the componentry and reassembling it, instead what they do is they squirt solvent in there in an attempt to wash away oils, and it's a terrible half-assed way of doing the job. And generally what happens is it just spreads grease and oil from one place to another. This is pretty dirty looking. Just unhook that spring, and that spring I just unhooked from the post there is on this main drive ring, which is referred to as the main lever in the service manual, even though it doesn't look much like a lever. I'll just lift off the shutter release. That's odd. That's missing its spring. There should have a return spring on there. It's gone. Alright. This camera's been a bit more interesting than I thought. Okay, so what other things have been buggered up on this camera? Let's remove the synchro gear. All of these parts are quite dirty. It'll be because of the flood cleaning most likely. Oh, this spring here is the high-speed spring for the shutter. It's incorrectly positioned. It's jammed on the far side of this flash lever. So this shutter has been seriously buggered about with by someone who had no idea what they were about. I'm absolutely surprised that the shutter worked as well as it did when I tested the camera. It did work after a fashion. Clearly if I'd tested a few more functions I would have discovered stuff that didn't work, especially the high speed. So we have an incorrectly assembled shutter, missing a spring, that has been flood cleaned, and Yeah, I hope that spring hasn't damaged the flash contact there. One other thing with flood cleaning, particularly on the Retina IIa, IIa cameras, is that the flash contact, which is on a plastic post here, that plastic post is made of some styrene-like plastic. It is extremely vulnerable to solvents. Another thing looks wrong. I'm not sure that's clipped into place properly. Let's get this spring off here. Yeah, the flash sync is all to hell and gone. None of that's in the correctly synchronized. That this shutter moved at all is just quite surprising. Can't quite get this to wriggle out. Yeah. Well, at least that spring is still present. I'm not sure it was assembled correctly. That is upside down. Okay, so by looking at this and seeing what's wrong with it, I can tell how deep someone got into it. This high-speed, the retard gear train here is damaged. That lever is bent. It's jamming on the body. That may or may not straighten up. So the retard gear train's been buggered with. Someone's had it out, I can tell, because this little tab is round further than I would have expected it to be. There's a few scour marks there where someone's been at it with a tool. Okay, could be fun. I'll remove the outer case. This little ring provides the detents for the diaphragm settings, aperture settings. I'll just slacken that screw off to release the flash wire, the sync wire. There's our curved rack. Now I'll be interested if that little plastic insulator is still there. It is. That's good. That means that most likely someone never removed that flash contact, because if they had, the little plastic insulator slug tends to get lost. If you're not looking for it, you won't see it. It's very small. Let's see if I can get this flash contact out. It's coming out. Oh, it looks a little bit fractured and unhappy, but that's not uncommon. Right, this tiny speck right here, which is about, I don't know, a millimetre by about half a millimetre. It's a cylindrical thing about half a millimetre in diameter. That is the insulator I was mentioning. It's quite commonly lost. We're fortunate to have it this time, otherwise I have to make a new one. As you can imagine, making tiny little things like that is a bother and a nuisance. Alright, so what do I know? Well, I know that the retard gear train has been mucked about with, probably lifted off the body. Certainly that lever's bent down. That's enough from the inside anyway. We can split the shutter, and to do that I undo the 3 screws from the back. That allows me to separate the shutter case from the mechanism plate. The shutter case will retain the diaphragm, and the shutter blades will be held in place by between the 2 components. See if I can get these apart. It might be almost glued in place. There we go, it's off. Alright. So there you can see the state of those shutter blades. They have a nasty look to them. They're very grey. It's probably graphite that you're seeing there, and it's probably the remains of the grease that was in here and has been shifted around. The graphite grease was probably on other parts of things, on parts that had settings and things. The diaphragm actually moves reasonably well, which is a surprise. It means there's not much oil as such left on there. There's just a lot of grey sort of stuff. Now that's probably graphite. Some of that is probably aluminium. It's like a powder on those blades in places. I think if I got a cotton bud, we could probably lift some of that off dry. Let's have a look. Yeah, that filth there, that's just coming off the back of those blades. That's very nasty. Okay, and there's our mechanism plate. Now people flood clean shutters because they don't know how to take them apart and put them back together again after cleaning them properly. See if I can position that blade back in place. I'm just looking at the lay of these blades to see if that has in fact been assembled correctly to start off with. It has. So whoever went in and serviced this shutter or attempted to play with the shutter last time almost certainly didn't split the case. They took it almost as far as that point, but those 3 screws they left alone and they didn't go in as deep as this. So this shutter is extremely filthy. A lot of that's down to the flood cleaning, and it means that grease and dirt and dust has been moved from pillar to post and it's settled on surfaces that normally wouldn't be contaminated. So we'll pop the mechanism plate to one side. I'll start with here. I'll start here on the shutter case. First thing I'm going to do is remove the lever, the aperture setting lever. You've got 2 screws. On these shutters you can get to them through cutouts over that plate, in that plate. On earlier Compur and Compur Rapid shutters you could not. There was no cutout there and you had to deal with it differently. Right. 3 screws hold the that screw's loose. 3 screws hold the retainer plate here. That screw's loose. That screw's almost loose. Tip the contents out. There we have it. All that has to be cleaned. This will eat a few cotton buds and lots of naphtha to get all this filth out of here. So I don't really know the history of this particular camera. The owner just asked me to service it for them. They certainly didn't tell me that they had an unsuccessful attempt at servicing it themselves, so I would imagine that it's just as likely that they bought it in a marketplace like eBay from someone who had had a go at it and perhaps improved its condition. Perhaps it didn't even work at all prior to them playing with it, and he sold it to them. And I can only hope they didn't say that it was freshly CLA'd. That would be a bit shameful. So, given the flood cleaning, now the flash contact, as I said, is particularly susceptible to solvent damage. And it doesn't look stunning, but it doesn't look like it's been melted into a blob, which is certainly what happens if somebody had had something fairly aggressive in here in the way of a solvent. I wouldn't even get naphtha near that plastic, that styrene. It starts looking soft if you look at it the wrong way. So perhaps someone's had a go at flood cleaning this with some other less exciting solvent. Isopropyl alcohol, something like that. It's pretty anemic when it comes to its degreasing ability, though it does have some. And perhaps that had been used, and it had, whatever it was a good enough solvent to shift the grease from where it was doing the job it was supposed to where it wasn't wanted at all. It's often said that shutters are meant to run dry, and that's true as far as it goes. When that was probably originally stated, the person who stated it probably meant it to mean that shutters, you don't oil shutters. Shutters don't need oil. Not that they don't need lubricant, but they don't need oil. So shutters do need lubricant. They just need a little bit of lubricant of the appropriate type in the appropriate places, and they don't need oil. So well-meaning people who think that shutters should be scrupulously clean of all contaminants and that they will work well without any lubrication at all are deluded. Nothing mechanical works well without some sort of lubricant. Get all these larger components done, and then I can turn my attention to those diaphragm blades, and they will all need to be cleaned individually to remove all that filth, and then the diaphragm can be reassembled into the shutter case. Let's have a look at these. The diaphragm blades are not symmetrical. They look much the same, but the rivets, if you've swapped one around, I don't know if you can see it, but the rivet at this end is closer to the middle of the blade than it is here. The rivet's on the very edge of the blade at one end and closer to the centre on the other. These are not sticking together, which means they don't have oil on them. They're just covered in that filthy leftover stuff there, whatever that residue is, and it must be solids from whatever lubricant or grease was in the camera. Maybe graphite, maybe a bit of aluminium in there too, who would know. I have to line these blades up so that I know which end I'm looking at, because when they get reassembled in to the shutter or onto the plate, they all need to go on the right way around. If you assemble them in a random fashion, you will have very odd shaped apertures. If you assemble them all the same way but back to front, the diaphragm may work after a fashion, but the diaphragm settings will certainly be wrong, and at one end or other of the range it probably will not want to move. The diaphragm blades are run on a fixed plate at one end, and the other end the plate is moving, it rotates as you adjust it, which serves to swing each of the blades inwards or outwards by rotating them against their pivot in the fixed plate. I'm still surprised that that shutter worked as well as it did, given the obvious faults in it. Certainly clear, I only gave it a cursory check to make sure it clicked and that the blades opened and shut. The speeds can't have been right, because the retard gear train wasn't tracking the cam. Or more correctly, it would have been tracking the cam, but the pallets were not engaging. The pallets weren't engaging because the arm that controls the engagement of the pallets was jammed from being bent. At least these blades aren't rusty. Sometimes if the camera has been kept in a moist place, a damp place, some damp cellar or shed, or if it had been caught out in the rain, put away in the cupboard in a damp leather case, then, well, that part's good. Now I've got to stop, find my jig to reassemble the diaphragm and then carry on. Okay, time to reassemble this diaphragm. It's my assembly jig. My assembly jig is made up of two 1/2-inch drive sockets. Deckel did make a jig for assembling diaphragms like this, or at least they published drawings for making a jig to assemble diaphragms like this, but I don't recall seeing one. So the blades have to be positioned in the fixed plate. The pivot, the rivets that are closer to the centre of the blade go into this fixed plate. There's a bit of bounce to those blades. It probably means they're not exactly flat. That probably means it was exercised a bit when the blades were covered in whatever solvent had been used, and that would have tended to stick them together. So that as you move the lever backwards and forwards, it stresses the blades up as one end's being pushed, and that action causes the blades to bow. And because they don't lie flat after that, because they're quite springy, it's hard to get them assembled correctly afterwards because they don't lay flat. As you can see, you've got to the point in the assembly where the blades have to be pulled back to allow the rest of the blades to be positioned correctly. And I can feel that one of those blades got displaced from its hole then, so I'm going to have to muck around with this to get everything seated correctly. I haven't got my, these aren't the best tweezers for doing this job. I don't know what I've done with my good tweezers. The last hole is right there. Oh, that doesn't look good. Right, let's see if I can get this correctly reassembled. I'm going to hold that down, lift this up, get those blades back over the top without disturbing anything. Now I know that at least one of those is probably out of its hole. Oh, here. What I'll have to try and do is encourage them back into the correct position. Oh yeah, certainly something wrong there. I'll have a go at that. Otherwise I've got to start again. No one likes starting again. So here's our moving disc, the one that swings them in and out as it's turned backwards and forwards. Trying to get these rivets back where they should be. Something's not right. Oh, yeah, okay, I can see that now. Alright, so that's way around there somewhere. Alright, so I have the blades in the moving ring correctly, but at least one of them has popped out of the fixed ring. So that could be fun. See if I can get this adjusted a bit better. That's better. The case only goes on in one position. Oh, yes, there's a few blades popped out of position there, so I'm going to have to work at getting that back into position. And my good tweezers are certainly hiding. I'll have to use other methods. Okay, plate should be over here. There are 3 screws hold this plate down. One of them has a countersunk screw. It needs to go back in the correct position or nothing's going to work. I've got 1 screw in there now, that'll hold things roughly in position. The other 2 screws can be dropped into place. These screws I am not doing up tightly, I'm just getting them started really. The blades, the pins on the blades have come out of their sockets that I'd carefully put them in, and as a result I've got to get them back in there before these screws get done up. Otherwise, not only will it not work, I could potentially damage something. Alright, so this is a mess. I'll start here. What I'm trying to do is pull those blades into position. Those rivets have a little hole in the centre of them, and I can just get the end of a needle in there. I can pick that hole up and then move the rivet over until it lines up with the hole in the plate. Usually if you've only got 1 or 2 blades misplaced, this is not an unreasonable way of doing things. In this case I've got the whole lot just about displaced, and it's not a reasonable way of doing things. I'm going to do it anyway. And 2. I've got all of them but 2 in correct position. And that one's going to go. Alright, let's pop that back in here for a bit of, just to give it a bit of resistance, that's in place. I can do this screw up slightly. The blades on that side are in position and that'll help hold them there while I manoeuvre the others. They're aligned but they're not dropping into place, which tells me that the rivets on the other sides of the blades have possibly moved out of their slots. I'll just tighten these screws very slightly to hold things where they currently are. And I can flip this over and rotate the moving plate and see if it'll pick up Yeah, that's dropped in. I've got one pivot is not in place. Just one. Okay, let's see if I move this ring. To go that way ideally. Still got that one blade that's out of position. Right, I can just about see the head of that now. I can just about pull that into position, I think. If I tighten that up slightly, loosen this slightly. I've got to grab it with the end of the needle and pull it forward. That's it. That's done. Right, let me run that screw up a little bit more and check to see if the moving pivots are all in their holes. They are. Okay, that diaphragm's working normally now. That's good. So I can nip those 3 screws up. The blades are still quite stained, I see, still quite grey looking. I'm going to try swabbing them with a bit of other solvent, see if I can get them a bit cleaner. I've got some CRC Electroclean, which is something nasty like carbon tet, but that's quite good. I'll be back shortly. Right, let's see if I can get some of that grey staining off these blades. You can see it's coming away on that Q-tip. Q-tip for Americans, cotton buds for Kiwis, and probably Aussies and Poms too. Interesting, the blades are cleaner on that face than this face. This face, of course, would have been to the rear of the camera. If that rear group had not been removed, then they wouldn't have had the benefit of any swab cleaning that whoever had done the flood cleaning may have done afterwards to mop up the mess they'd made. That looks quite good. Even with that little bit of solvent on the blades are quite stiff to move. Takes very little to stick the blades together. They'll be fine when they dry out. Right, so here we have the settings lever. That goes on in one position. There are cutouts in the edge of the case here where the levers go through the top for the shutter release and so forth, and this goes to the bottom. So I'm just lining that up by eye. I've got my screwdriver scattered all over the table here, so I can't find the right one. That one, pick that one up fine, and one at the other end. Yeah, that moves smoothly. It's not without resistance because this settings lever has been intentionally bent to provide friction between it and the back of the case. And you want some friction there because otherwise you can knock your aperture settings out of where you'd set them very easily. So you certainly need them to be some friction there, but the friction is coming from that lever. It's not coming from the blades itself. It's not being caused by drag on those blades, and it's not causing the blades to distort. So that's the first half, or first part of the shutter servicing.